everyone, in this video we are going to implement logging in our RESTful web service application using Spring Framework. First, we need to understand the dependencies related to logging when using Spring Boot application. Spring Boot internally uses Apache Commons logging for doing all the logging statement in the application. Okay, so when you're using Spring Boot, and in Spring Boot, if you have dependency with Spring Boot starter web in your pom.xml file, what it does is it uses Spring JCL API. Okay, and that is based on the Apache Commons logging. So if you look at the Maven dependency, and if you scroll down, you can somewhere find Spring JCL, and you can see that when you expand, you see Apache Commons logging. Okay, and what it does is it has a dependency on Spring Boot starter logging. Okay, so when you add the Spring Boot starter, it also adds the Spring Boot starter logging. And this pulls all the specifications, that is logging interfaces, and also the default implementation, that is logback. So Spring uses logback as the default logging implementation. And you can see that along with the specification and the implementation, it also has, the bridging libraries. So you don't need to manually add any of the bridging libraries. If any of the third-party API uses log4j or JUL, it will be taken care by this logging, that is bridging libraries. All you need to do is, if a third-party library is using any legacy APIs, then you need to exclude them from that dependency, and these bridging libraries will take care of that. So if you scroll down, and let's look at other logging APIs that we have in our application, Maven dependency, you can also see there is Jboss Logging, as we are using Spring Data JPA. And JPA is the specification and Hibernate is the actual implementation. So what Hibernate uses is the Jboss Logging internally for the log statements. And again, Jboss Logging is a specification. Okay, it's not an implementation, just like what we have with SLF4J API. This is also a specification, and you can see that we also have log4j API too. Okay, this is the log4j2. This is also a specification. So with multiple specification in class path, that is okay, but it's only the logback that is the only implementation that you have here in your class path. Okay, so with that, what we're going to do is, in our application, we are going to use log4j2, okay, as our logging implementation. To do that, first thing is we need to exclude the logback in our class path. So how we are going to do that? First, let's add let me try to add a dependency that excludes the logback, and for that, I'm going to use here a dependency. And what I'm going to do is, when I add a Spring Boot starter, I'll exclude the logging. Okay, so this is what I'm going to exclude. With this being excluded, what it's going to do is it's going to remove all these APIs. Okay, and then I have the dependency of log4j2. Now with this being added, what it does is, with Spring Boot starter log4j2, it adds all the dependencies, that is bridging libraries, as well as the specification, and also the log4j2 API. Okay, so let's do that. First, let's save it and see what our dependency added in our Maven hierarchy here. If you see, all those libraries are gone, but if you scroll down, you can see they are added back with specification of SLF4J and also the log4j API, and now you have log4j core, that is our implementation. And along with that, we have the bridging libraries here. Fine. With that, now what we're going to do is we are good to use the logging statements in our application. So let's go to our flight controller, and here I'm going to do is I'm going to create a static reference variable, and I'll call this as logger, and this will be from, and you can see there are multiple loggers. Okay, we need to look for something that is coming from the log4j2 specification API. So I'm going to use this, and then I'll name this as logger, and I'm going to use logger manager, and this is again from log4j2 dot get logger dot class. Okay, so now I have the reference ready, and now I can use the logging statement. So for demo, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the getFlyId method, and here I'll just have all the logging levels added. So for that, let me bring those statements here, and you can see that what I did, I added info message, debug message, warning message, error, and trace, and I'm printing the flight ID that is coming within the request. Okay, so with this, let me save and let me start this server and try to access it through Postman and see how the statements are printed in the console. Okay, the server is up and running, so I'll clear the console and go to Postman, and in the get method I'll just click on send. So what I'm doing, I'm trying to search for flight ID 8. Let's go back to our ID console, and you can see that we have info, warning, and error. Okay, so here you can see that we have 5 statements, but it just printed info, warning, and error. The debug and trace is not printed. So this is nothing but actually the logging levels. Okay, the levels that we have is, we have multiple logging levels, and let me bring that up here so I can show you. So these are the different logging levels. We have all, trace, debug, info, warning, error, and fatal. Okay, and this is from highest to the lowest. So if you are using info, okay, then all the messages that are like info, warning, and error, and fatal will be printed in your console. Okay, the one that is debug and trace will not be printed because your configuration is having info level setup. Okay, and if you put that as debug, then all the debug, info, warning, error, and fatal will be printed in your console. Okay, so then which one you should be using? So remember that for your development environment, whether it may be testing or dev or your local environment, it is recommended that you use debug level, and for production you use info. Okay, and we don't want to print any trace or debug in your production environment. Okay, so with this configuration, actually, where did we configure this? Okay, and this is basically a 0 configuration. If you're using Spring Boot, all these are by default configured. So in Spring Boot, the info, if you see here, the debug and the trace was not printed because there is a property called logging.level.root is equal to info. This is the root logger. The level is set to info. That means all the logging statement in your application, whether it may be the packages that you have or any or the packages in your jar files, if there are logging statements, all those will be printed if they are info and lower levels. Okay, so now let's change this to debug. From info to the default is info, so now we are changing it to debug. So let's save this and see now what happens. Now you can see that earlier we didn't get the info messages, but now we started getting the debug, right? So you can see that we have a lot of messages compared to previous run. Now this time what I'm going to do is, let's go back to our Postman and resend this. Now if you go back to our IDE and you can see in the console, you would see this time the debug, right? So this way, if you change it to trace and if you turn on the trace level here, what it's going to do is it's going to, fill your console with all the trace messages, and that would be tough for you to just go through, those many lines. So it's better that you use debug, and then in higher environments like production, use info. Okay, so this configuration is called as zero configuration. You did nothing, like you did not add any configuration related to your logging. All you did is you added the dependency and then made use of the API, that is your logging specification from log4j2. So what happens if you want to add custom configurations? Okay, like you want to have more control over the packages here. I want all this information that is within logging statement within my custom packages to be debug level, whereas the root I want to be it as info. So those configuration you can have it here too, like you can have logging dot level, and then you can add your package name. Okay, like you can see it auto populated. I'll have com dot gain IT, and this way I can do that configuration. Again, this is very basic configurations that you're adding. Okay, but the configuration that I'm saying is with the pattern, for example, the pattern and all those. You can do that here too somehow, but it is always recommended that if you are using custom configurations, it's better that you add you add a custom configuration file and have all those configuration declared in that file. Okay, so let's try this first, and then we'll look at how we can create the configuration file. So for now, if I go back to my Postman and click on send, and you can see that debug is printed. We have the root as info, and for our custom packages, we have the label as debug. Okay, so this is the zero configuration with logging. Let's try to create a custom configuration file and update the patterns that we want. The pattern means the look and feel of your statements here. So for that, let's first stop the server. And what I'm going to do is, in the resources folder, I'm going to create a file called, and I'm going to create this as an XML file. You can have a JSON file or YML file. Okay, but whichever you're comfortable with. I'm going to use XML file, so let's use that. And the file naming standard, you can use there are two file namings, that is log4j2.xml file, or you can use -spring. So these are the two file names which actually the Spring Boot is going to search under resources folder, that is in the class path. So I'm going to keep this as log4j2 and then click on finish. And here what I'm going to do is, now the root tag that I'm going to have is called as configuration. Okay, and in configuration, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a tag for appenders. And in appenders, I'm going to use the console appender. And for console, I'll name this as console, and the target I'm going to use it as system out. Okay, so it's going to print everything in my system console. Okay, so now next what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a pattern for the logging statement. So let me pull that from a notepad here. And here what we are doing is we are using the pattern like style. I'm going to style it with colors, and the date is going to be an ISO, and it's going to be of black format. That is, the color is going to be black, and it's kind of similar what we have here, but just a few changes. And then I'm going to highlight the level, that is the logging level. Then I'm going to style the thread, that is the running thread here, and I'm going to give it as bright blue. So that is basically this one. And then I'm going to style the class with bright yellow, that is this part. And then I'm going to print the message. Okay, so with that, let's add our loggers. And it's always must to have a root logger, and the level I'm going to give this as info, and it should be in the root. And then here I'm going to add the appender, an appender reference, and the appender reference here is console. Perfect. With this, we have our console, that is the root loggers, and the reference is console. I'm going to add another logger, and this is going to be my custom logger, that is for my custom packages. com.gain id can airline web service. Okay, and what I'm going to have this as, the level is going to be debug. Perfect. So this is a very simple configuration that we have for log4j. So let's run our application. So what it's going to do is, the Spring Boot is going to look for log4j2.xml file. If it is available, then it's going to use this. If it is not, then it's going to use the default configuration of log4j2. And this is basically coming from one of the, if you don't use log4j2, then it's going to use one from the actual API, okay, actual API of the dependency that you have added here. Okay, let me show you that so it's clear. It should be somewhere in your Spring Boot jar file. Yeah, so if you see here, we have Spring Boot, and if you scroll down, and you can see the log4j here, and this is the file that it will load. Okay, if you don't give any custom log4j for your configuration here, then Spring Boot is going to use the one that comes with the API that is within the Spring Boot jar file. So as we added here, it is going to make use of this file, and what we have done, we have just added an appender, that is a console appender, the pattern, and the loggers. We have a root logger that is using console, and that will print all the info, whereas we have another logger that is going to print all our custom packages. The level is debug. So let's start our server. And you can see that it is not printing any style, though it is using the pattern that we have here. It is because we need to add an attribute called disable ANSI as false. Let's try to save this, and you can see now the style is being now used in our pattern. So this is the attribute that we added, and that enabled the styling. So you can see the date format, that is ISO, and then we have the level that is highlighted, and then the thread that is bright blue, then we have bright yellow, that is our class, and then followed by the message or the throwable message here. Okay, so good. With this, now what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our Postman and resend the request. And in the console, you can see we get the information, that is including debug, because we have set the level as debug here. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we are going to add another appender for file. So let's do that. Let me bring that up from my notepad and then I'll walk you through. And here you can see what we have done is we have added a rolling appender. That is, we are going to write our logs to a file, and I have created the file name is going to be this, that is Spring Boot Logger, and the pattern I'm going to use is basically the what happens when this policy emits. I'm using 3 policies. One is on startup, that means every time the instance starts, then it's going to create a file. And next, size based policy, that is if the file reaches 10 MB of size, then it's going to roll over a new file. And then time based, that means daily basis, every day the file will be rolled over. So these are the policies that I'm using. For file name, what I'm using, the name is rolling file name is going to be this, and the pattern is this. I'm going to use a date and the name, and then I'm going to zip it with gz extension, that is whenever the policy criteria is met. Then here I'm going to add the appender into my loggers, and I'll name this as rolling file, and that's it. Let's save this and let the application restart. Okay, the console appender is fine. Let's go to our work folder, and you can see that the file is created here. Let me refresh. Okay, looks like it is not updated. Is something missing here? Let's look at the rolling appender. Okay, appenders is reference rolling file, so it should be okay. Let's go back again. Okay, the reason why it is not printing anything in my log file is with the file names here. I need to have the double slash, and let me stop the server first and then save this file and then start it again. And this time it should work. Let's see. And if I go to my work folder, and you can see that the policy does work. If you see, every time the server starts, it creates a gz file here, and the actual log file is here. Okay, let's refresh this, and it is started, so it should create the file. And if I try to refresh, somehow it is not picking this file. Let's see why, and I can see that it's all right. The log files work logs, and sometimes it does not print. Let's see. Let's open this file. Oh, it took time. You can see it took time, and it was created. So somehow it was not showing up. The size was 0 KB, but when I tried opening it, it has all the logs within it. So yeah, sometimes we need to look at actual what is happening here when you open the file and you see everything is working as expected. Okay, so with that, what we have done, we have now added the file appenders, that is rolling file appender, and printed all our log statements on console as well as in the file. So now, as I said, we have debug for development environment, and for production, it is always recommended that we have info messages. So how do we configure that? For like environment specific logging file. So there are multiple approaches that you can see in projects. Okay, and every project has their own way of implementing environment specific file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you one way of doing it and explain you a better approach that you can have in your project. So first thing you can do is you can, if you're in a local environment, okay, and you can have environment specific folder, okay, like, let me first stop the server here. What I'm going to do is under source resource folder, I'm going to create a folder called local. Okay, let's do that. And I'll name this as local. And this way you can have dev folder, test folder, and production folder, depending on the environments that you have. Then I'm going to rename this application properties to the profile that we have. Here we have local, and the same way you're going to have dev, test, and production. Okay, and this is what I'm going to do. I'm just copying this file that is log4j and placing it into the local folder. And now I'll delete the log4j2 file from the resource folder. Now with this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to logging config. We have a property called logging config, and this is where I will specify the path for the log4j, that is local log4j to XML file. And as this is in a class path, I will put the class path here. With this, I'll save, and what I'm going to do is when I run this application, I'm going to use the profile here as a run configuration, and here the profile is going to be local. If you have a different profile, you can use in your profile section here, and then run this, and let's see what happens. And you can see that the profile here, the active profile, is local, and then it searches for, it uses this application local properties file, and this we have configured the path of the configuration file, logging file, and it's going to use this one, this configuration here. Okay, to make sure that it is using this, let's do one thing. Let's change this to red instead of, and let me stop this. I'm sure that the changes are updated. Now let's restart. And you can see that the thread color is red. So it is picking this file. So that's how you can have environment specific folder, and each folder have its own properties file, that is configuration file. It can be logging properties file, or it can be any of the configuration file related to your whatever file you think that you want in your environment specific configuration. Okay, and then the application properties, again, you should have different files for each environment. Okay, so this is one approach, okay, the simplest approach which you can have it in your application. But what it does is it exposes all the configuration for your environments, whether it may be production or test or dev. Okay, there is a better approach. That is, what you can do is you can have this file, that is configuration files, in your resources folder, and these files will be specific to your local environment, that is for the development environment. Okay, you don't need to make any configuration changes. And during your development cycle, that is in the phase of deployment, when you're using DevOps lifecycle chain, and in that you have a job to build the artifact, that is using Maven tool, then what you do is first you pull the your branch, right? You pull your branch from the repository for your application. During that stage, what you can do is you can also pull the environment specific properties file from your repository, and that can be a different project, okay, in your repository. You can use GitHub, Bitbucket, or GitLab. So any of the repository. In that, you're going to have your environment specific folder, which will have all the configuration files, okay, including your application properties file. And then during the build process, we are going to pull those files and place it in your resources folder. So what that is going to do is that is going to replace the application properties file and also all the other configuration files that you have. Okay, so in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to revert this back to what it was before. Okay, and I'm just going to delete this and rename this back to application properties. And this, I don't need this anymore because Spring Boot by default searches for log4j2 XML file. So this way, what we have is in our application, we have all the configuration files related to local environment. So for environment specific, you're going to pull that from the Git repository during your build cycle. Okay, so when you're doing the deployment, basically. So all the configuration files and like production property environment and all those are going to be a one-time creation, and whenever you want to update those, you can just separately pull that repository and update those files. Okay, that way we are not exposing all the configurations every time you are developing anything in your application. Okay, so that's one of the approaches, and more recommended way where you don't expose your production files, especially configurations. Okay, so here that's we have seen how we can configure a logging implementation with zero configuration, and we also added the custom configuration. That is, we added a configuration with Appender's console and a rolling file. Okay, and we also looked at how we can have environment specific logging configuration. Okay, so I hope now you have some understanding on how to implement logging in your application. And that's all for this video, and I'll see you in the next session.